My name's Jackie Newling. I'm a colonial gastronomer and I'm in the kitchen at Elizabeth Farm today to make a kangaroo steamer. Now a kangaroo steamer is, I guess, a little bit like a terrine or a meatloaf, but it was cooked in a clay jar, a clay pot. Today we're going to use glass because it's a little perhaps more sterile and available to us, but we'll talk about the traditional techniques as we go through. Kangaroo steamer is a good example of the way European colonists adapted local ingredients to their way of cooking. Kangaroo meat was readily available in the colony, and often it was the only fresh meat available to people. The most common meat was salt pork, because without refrigeration, that could stay fresh. So this was a good way of combining the fresh and the preserved meat. So colonists would combine their raw meat with their salted meat, which would add flavour, and because kangaroo is very lean, it would also add a fat content. So the kangaroo meat itself we can now buy already minced, but of course that would have to have been done by the family cook, or if you didn't have a family cook, if you were the cook, you'd have to do it yourself. People like the MacArthurs, who were a wealthy family, kept a gamekeeper. So they had fresh kangaroo meat on their table every week. And of course we can add extra flavour with whatever fresh ingredients at hand, perhaps some onion, and some herbs and spices, a pinch of salt, pepper, herbs if you have them at hand, fresh from the garden or dried, and very typical of colonial times, some allspice, which comes from South America or Jamaica, and a little bit of nutmeg. And of course spices were readily available in the colony because even though Australia is a long way away, it was well connected with the shipping routes to China and India and then back to Europe. Now we know the steamer was a very popular dish in colonial times. It's mentioned in people's journals and diaries right back from the 1820s. One of the governor's wives, Lady Jane Franklin, wrote about it when she visited Tasmania in the late 1830s. And she gives us a really good, first sort of almost a recipe, a description of what went in it, including the nutmeg and the herbs. The recipe wasn't formally published, to our knowledge at least, until 1864, when there were 3 versions of a kangaroo steamer in the first known Australian cookbook by a gentleman by the name of Edward Abbott. So it celebrates its 150th birthday this year, this book. And it was quite common to add alcohol to a dish, either wine, I'm using port today, but you could add a little bit of brandy if you had it at hand. Just something to moisten it up and give it a bit more character. And a little bit of ketchup, believe it or not. Not tomato sauce, a bit early for tomatoes in the colony. This is a mushroom ketchup. Once all our ingredients are combined, we're now going to pack them into a jar. So these days we would use glass because it's much cleaner and safer, but in colonial times it would have been clay or ceramic. And in a way, we've sort of made a coarse sausage mince. So you could almost think of it as a sausage in a jar. One diarist described it as a sort of haggis. Just going to add a little bay leaf and just a few juniper berries. Juniper is a European herb. A lot of people think of gin when they think of juniper because it's a main flavouring. We need to seal our jar quite tightly, and the whole process is not dissimilar to a very traditional English style of cooking called jugging. So you hear of jugged hare or jugged venison, or in this case jugged wallaby or kangaroo, so that the jar doesn't rattle around in the pan and drive us all crazy as it comes to the boil. The old cookbooks recommend you pop a few little straws underneath, or a little layer of hay even, just so it's not sitting on the very hard bottom of the pot. I've used a bamboo skewer. So we fill our pot with water to almost cover almost up to the top of the jar, and that would have to cook for several hours. The advantage of doing it on the stove, of course, is not everybody had an oven, only wealthy families, perhaps like the MacArthurs. So even if you were a bushie, just with a billy, you could make this dish. Elizabeth Farm was the home of the MacArthur family, a very, very prominent family in Australian history. This property is now a museum, and you can come and visit Elizabeth Farm and this kitchen on weekends and in school holidays. It preserves our colonial history and some of colonial Australia's early success stories. So once our steamer's cooked on the stove for several hours, and of course the size of the pot will depend really how long you cook it for. This one's had about 3 or 4 hours. There we go. So studying the history books, we're not really quite sure how it was served or what with. Though Lady Jane Franklin does say it was a hot dish at lunch, served in little rounds. So perhaps with some steamed potatoes, vegetables, that sort of thing, or trusty damper. And you could also serve it cold, ploughman's lunch style. A seal, of course, would keep it well preserved. You could keep it in a cellar or a cool place, slice it up to go on a lunch plate. The cookery books say that this could be kept this way for up to 12 months as a preserved meat. So these days sometimes you have potted meats and pastes and things. And of course this would be a good supper perhaps. Or for a traveller, you know, a swaggy or a bushie, he could of course draw on that while he's on the move.